Good morning, Chair.
Good morning.
Chair,
Before you begin, is the transcriber in the room? Probably not.
she is indeed. I'm looking at her.
Oh, fine. Okay.
Chair, may I call Mr. Brian Trotter, please?
Of course, yeah.
Hello, Mr. Trotter. I understand you are affirming?
I am, yes.
Okay, if you'd like to repeat after me, please. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Trotter. My name is Ruth Kennedy and I ask questions on behalf of the inquiry. Could you confirm your full name, please?
My full name is Brian Alexander Trotter.
And you gave a witness statement to the inquiry, which is at WITN 00980100. Do you have that statement in front of you?
I do, yeah.
And if you turn to page 22, is that your signature there?
It is, yes.
And it should be dated the 4th of January 2023, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Have you read through this statement recently?
I have, yes.
And is it true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
It is, yeah.
That statement is now in evidence. Everything that I ask you will be supplementary to that. Could you start by telling us what did you do before you joined the post office?
Before I actually joined Royal Mail Group in 1980, so before then I was in the Royal Navy for 6 years. When I joined the post office in 1980, it was at that time it was classed as post office telegrams. So I was there from 1980 to 1982 and made a decision to move into the counter side of the post office. So I worked at the counter for a couple of years, well, 5 years actually, between 80.
When did you do that? When did you move to counters?
From 1982, I moved to the counter and I worked on the counter for about 5 years to 1987. I was then promoted to assistant branch manager at the branch I worked at, and then an opportunity came up, and forgive me, I'm not completely accurate with dates here, but I think around 1990, I moved up north to a branch in very well north in Scotland, actually, Peterhead. Relocated up there with my family till 1993. There was a restructure of the post office at that time, so I moved back down south to the Central Belt, and I was appointed to, it was a new concept in the post office, I was the regional helpline manager from 1993 to 95, and from there I think my witness statement covers pretty much the rest of my career.
And you stayed at the post office until 2020, is that right?
Yes.
And between 1995 and 2005, your role was an area manager role?
That's correct, yeah.
Could you tell us a bit about what that involved?
Primarily, you were responsible for looking after a geographical patch, so it could be anywhere between, a couple of hundred offices at that time, close to 1,000 maybe. And the responsibility was to try and make sure that every office in that patch, you went to see them at least once a year. More concentration was given, obviously, in the bigger branches where there was more issues, if you like. So there was more face-to-face contact in the bigger branches, and I think I've said in my statement, in the smaller branches.
Should we turn that up? So WITN 00980100, and if we go to page 2.
Yeah, I've actually said there, depending on branch size.
Yes. Yeah, so I think you're looking at paragraph 5.
That's correct, yeah.
Which says, initially this role included visiting branches as determined by the head of retail network, usually once a year, and dependent on branch size, I would also manage site's adherence to business standards. This could be done by face-to-face visits, telephone or written correspondence. This management activity would be triggered by a wide range of issues, including customer complaints or postmasters asking for assistance, which was mainly via the National Business Support Centre helpline. So you generally go to visit the branches once a year, but you would also go when it was a management activity triggered it, is that right?
Yeah, so for example, if an inquiry or a complaint came in about a branch, then you would need to go and speak to the postmaster and get their version of events. Obviously, that was important. I'm not being completely correct in my terminology there about the helpline. I think in those days there would have been some sort of helpline, but forgive me again, I'm struggling to remember what kind of structure was in place. But generally speaking, any escalations for branches came through some sort of centre, whether that be regional centres or, later on in my career, it was generally the centre of the business.
And how often would you visit branches because there had been some kind of issue that had come to you through management?
It's really difficult to remember, actually. Thinking back about this, the whole programme was driven by the number of branches in your area, the size, and I guess potentially the number of problems. That was the rationale. If there's a bigger branch, then potentially there could be more problems. The smaller branches that were in the rural part of the network, less footfall, less customers, generally, they created less problems. But that was the sort of rule or the measure that we used to determine or drive the visit programme.
If we could turn back to your statement and scroll down to paragraph 6, please.
Yep.
It says there that this rule did not deal with quality assurance or training. However, I supported the rollout of Horizon by supporting postmasters with their first balance post-implementation of Horizon. Agents would already have some training, but I would go in person to the site and handhold the postmasters through the Horizon balancing process in the first week. Can you explain to us what that was like, or what your experience was when Horizon was first rolled out?
Yeah, so when Horizon was first rolled out, I think it's been mentioned earlier in the inquiry, the retail line or area managers, as it's known, were responsible for supporting the first balance or the first follow-up balance. So essentially what that meant was I would make contact with the postmaster probably a couple of days before the balance was due to let them know I was coming. We'd just have a general conversation about how things were going. I would ask them if there was any issues, that they wanted to speak about, I could potentially flag up, because they could be flagged back up to a central point. From there, on the day the balance was due, I would arrive a couple of hours earlier before it was due. We just talk about, again, how things were going. We talk about the work aids that were available, were they using them? And when the branch closed for business, then we would systematically work through the balance process until its completion. And that could take anywhere between a couple of hours and as much as it could fall into the following day. It really depended on I guess, how well the postmaster had grasped the operation of the new system.
And did you deal with anyone who was struggling with the operation of the new system?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think again, depending on where the branch was, how many staff were employed in the branch. For example, if it was a rural branch, it might be one person running the branch, and they're obviously try to get their head around this big change. Get used to using IT. So, in my mindset, I had to make allowances for that and say, right, okay, if it was me, how would I actually systematically work through this process to make sure that when I did actually leave the branch, they would feel capable and equipped for the following week. I mean, what would happen is if you'd completed the process or the balance and you felt in your mind that there was some still issues, from memory, we had like a hot desk in the retail line. We could flag that back up to an individual and say, look, although the balance has gone reasonably well, this may require another visit. It may require another support visit to help them through the balance. That was kind of how it worked.
And how common was that, what you've just described, flagging something for further assistance?
I mean, I've given this a great amount of thought and detail, and given, because in the main, my responsibility was visiting branches or going to branches in Scotland, so you had the geographical challenge. In addition to that, in Scotland, you do have a lot of rural branches, that are in isolated locations. I couldn't put a figure on it or a number on it, but I would say if you ask me a general question, I would say that it would be more challenging for rural branches, in and maybe there's only the postmaster there or maybe one other member of staff. Bigger branches that could consult with each other, you know, the staff and the postmaster, they seem to have a better idea of how to use the IT and a better grasp actually working their way through the balance process.
Focusing on the rural branches then, which you said tended to have more problems, was it quite common then for sub-postmasters in that situation to say they were struggling at this time?
I would think so. When you were there, you would encourage them to be open. You know, it wasn't in anybody's interest to leave that branch, and it's certainly not in my nature to walk away from somebody and say, look, you've had, you know, your one balance support visit. My nature was always try to be helpful and supportive. So if I thought that there was any indication or any evidence actually that we're going to struggle, I would have been putting it back up the line to say, look, we really do need to continue maybe putting in another support visit. The challenge of that was obviously because of the size of the programme, a visit schedule had already been put in place, but we could work within that. You know, you could go back to the branch outside of the balance day and spend some time with the postmaster and just maybe go through the work aids again, you know, the support material, just to try and help them along.
Turning back to your statement, if we could turn over the page to paragraph 7, please. You say there, at this stage, the contract manager for each particular area would have dealt with any allegations or suspicions of false accounting, and therefore, as area manager, I had very minimal dialogue on interventions or suspensions, although I may have got involved with meeting a postmaster after red flags were raised via escalation from support teams or field intervention teams. When would a red flag be raised, and what would that involve?
I mean, there was certain, paperwork or materials that came from the centre that didn't go through the contracts team. It was more appropriate to have a field visit. So in those days, before we actually moved to the next restructure, the area manager was responsible for going out to actually speak to the postmaster. I think it was important to get, you know, both sides of the story, you know, get their version of events. And what I used to find from experience was that if you spoke to a postmaster in those days when you actually went to visit offices, it was more of an informal discussion, and you could sit down and go through things logically. And again, if there was anything that they said during that informal meeting, you could push it back up the line. It didn't mean to say that when you got the paperwork, that was the end of it. You know, it wasn't an automatic default to, right, we think you've made a mistake, you must pay the money. How
often were red flags raised, or how often were you doing that kind of job or role?
I can't really say. It's difficult to determine or estimate actually, because during that time, I mean, it was the early days of Horizon. There was a new structure. I think I haven't actually mentioned in my statement until I think it's the second last paragraph, second last line in 2001. A restructure took place in 2001, where we had dedicated contracts managers, and generally, although I wasn't one at that stage, generally they took responsibility for those red flags. Our role was to continue working with the agent to make sure that business standards were being maintained. You know, there wasn't too many customer complaints, that sort of thing.
So did you feel that an area manager role was more of a supportive role? Whereas, sorry, go on.
Sorry, that was the impression I got. Yeah, certainly, and again, following that restructure. The focus of the business at that time was to allow area managers to concentrate on, you know, either building new relationships with new agents or continue developing relationships with existing agents.
You then moved to a role as a contract manager between 2004 and 2006, contracts and service manager, and then that in 2006 changed to contract advisor, but it was all broadly the same role. Is that right?
Yeah, broadly speaking, it was the same role. It was looking after all aspects of the agent's contract. The only difference was that, again, because another restructure took place in the post office in 2004, where they split sales and service. So to address that, the team that I worked in between 2004 and 2006, I had line management responsibility. We had a team in the area that I was responsible for, had a couple of area intervention managers and an area performance manager.
who reported in to you.
Yes.
And your geographical scope covered about 1,000 branches, is that right?
It was, but in the days, they were still recutting the areas, and again, I've thought about this in a bit more detail. Possibly at that time, I may have been covering Northern Ireland as well. So my area geographically could have been possibly as big as, I think, guessing between 16 and 1,700 branches. But again, a realignment took place as the structure developed and embedded itself to make it a fairer balance of branches.
And as a contract manager, your role did involve audits. I know you say in your statement you didn't organise them, but could you tell us how you were involved in audits?
So in my role as a contracts manager, well, just to go back a step, generally speaking, the audits would be requested and planned by the centre. So they would be unannounced, unless it was, we had the only other audit in out of that sphere was audits that followed a new postmaster being appointed. That was usually sort of 9 months to a year after. But to answer your question, yeah, an audit would be scheduled from the centre. I would become involved when the lead audit was ready to report their findings. So that could be, a couple of hours after the audit started, or it could be at the end of the day. It really depended on the complexity and the findings.
And how often were you having to go and speak to sub-postmasters and inform them of the results of an audit?
Well, if the audit went, if the audit was done and there was no issues, then the branch would be allowed. I mean, they would phone me and say, look, Brian, the audit's been done, we've been here, there's no issues, we're going to reopen the branch. I would only really be contacted urgently if there was an issue or a problem at the branch concerning the balance.
And if there was a problem concerning the balance, you would meet with the sub-postmaster. Is that right?
That would be later on the day of the audit. I mean, there's sort of 3 steps. When the audit was taking place, we would work through a checklist of quite a lot of, checking a lot of detailed documents. We'd be checking like call logs for the NBSC. We'd be checking to see how the training had gone. We'd be checking to see how the application interview went. So really what I'd be doing, I'd be logically working through a list of things that had happened before the audit took place, so that when I eventually spoke to the lead audit or when I spoke to the postmaster, I'd be fully appraised of what had actually happened before the audit.
If we could turn up your statement again, WITN 00980, thank you. And if we could turn over the page to page 4, please.
Okay, yeah.
And just looking at, scrolling down to paragraph 11.
Yeah.
You set out in paragraph 11 what happens on completion of the audit. And you say, on completion of the audit, I would speak to the postmaster and go through the findings. I might have also made reference to any checks that had been undertaken during the audit, such as call logs, training records, horizon reports, and any other interventions which have been undertaken by the contracts team. And that's the process you've just been describing, is that right?
Yes, that's it, yeah.
You then go on to say it was usual at this stage for the postmaster either to admit to misusing funds or to say they couldn't provide an explanation for the shortage.
Yes.
Taking each one of those in turn, how usual was it for the postmaster to admit that they had misused the funds in this type of situation?
I think that the percentage could be quite high. That conversation might even have taken place before I spoke to the postmaster. I mean, again, racking my brain for examples. I mean, I do remember that an audit was done at a branch, and forgive me, I don't recall the name, but it's pretty much as soon as he walked through the door, the postmaster had admitted to the lead audit that he'd went to the cash and carry the day before, and he'd intended replacing the money. I mean, it wasn't a massive sum of money, but those sort of scenarios happened where you might get an explanation straight away, or you could, in actual fact, I could go through my tick list, I could speak to the postmaster, I could speak to my line manager, we'd do further checks as a result of doing the audit, and still come to the conclusion that there was no explanation.
Yes, and when there was no explanation, or the sub-postmaster said they didn't have an explanation, how often did that happen?
I really think it depends on the time and day. I mean, I could say that there could be quite a high percentage of those where You know, you've seen the audit report, and it's reported as unexplained. So an unexplained audit, in my mind, needed further investigation. If the answer wasn't in the branch on that day of the audit.
If we could turn over the page to page 5, please. And looking at paragraph 16, which is at the bottom. You talk there about where concerns are raised about the functionality of the Horizon system. If a balance couldn't be explained, did it ever cross your mind that it might be a problem with Horizon itself?
Not really, no, because throughout the programme, the messaging was the system was fit for purpose, it was secure. I'm not technically minded when it comes to front office, processing packages, but in my mind, I believed that it was operating the way it was intended. The reason I deducted that was because I had been a user, and in my experience, and I can only talk about my experience, it always worked as intended.
In paragraph 16, you say, if concerns were raised about the functionality of the Horizon system, then I would raise them with my line manager and also the appropriate technology team for input into the report. I recall that if there was no obvious explanation for problems, I would monitor the performance of the temporary postmaster to see if the same problem continued. However, from my personal experience, there were no problems with temporary postmasters. So in terms of your investigation that you carried out, you basically passed it on to technical people and your line manager, is that right?
Yeah, I don't think I was equipped to actually come to some sort of conclusion or decision about technical matters like that. There was people that worked in the business that were much better qualified than me, that could look at a situation. Or if a postmaster said to me, look, Brian, this has been going on for a while. To explain in its broadest terms, I would say, look, I'm pulling my hair out here, and these losses are reoccurring. They'd ask for an opinion, try and get some answers. So the only place that I could actually go at that time was put a red flag against it and pass it back up the line and keep pushing until I got some answers.
And did you trust the technical people to give you the right answers?
I had to, yeah, because I trusted their judgment, but also had known these individuals for a number of years, had not worked directly beside them, but worked in the same teams on other projects and other things. So I trusted them to take ownership of the problem and deal with it for me. That's pretty much what I would say.
And that last line of that paragraph about monitoring temporary postmasters, if the temporary postmaster had no problems, did you take that as evidence or a factor to take into account in the fact that it was the sub-postmaster who'd made the mistake? It wasn't a system error.
Well, when I put that paragraph in my statement, because when I was thinking about it, and forgive me, I don't remember the year, but I do remember dealing with a case in Glasgow, actually, with a postmaster. And I think this is maybe where I was an area manager at the time, possibly, that he was concerned about ongoing losses that were reoccurring. It was quite a big branch, he employed quite a few staff. And it got to a point that the shortfalls were so high, a decision was made to suspend. But following the suspension, one of our large temporary sub-postmaster companies took over the branch, and they put some very, very strict and rigid controls in place. And after about 6 weeks, or maybe longer than that, they reported back to me to say that they'd found a thief working in the branch. She'd been using the postmaster's money to pay her bills.
So was your assumption that if there was no problem with the temporary sub-postmasters, that there was a thief in the branch or someone misusing post office funds?
No, I think I still had an open mind. I think I put that as an example of being that case. I think if any postmaster had come to me, and I guess the relationship as an area manager was different from contracts manager, because you're visiting the branches and you get to know these people, because at the end of the day, they're human beings, and they could take, they were happy, they're comfortable taking you into your confidence and saying, look, this has been going on for a while, Brian, this is what I'm doing, is there any more that I can do to prevent or reduce these shortfalls? And that's where I would, possibly look at extra training if it was available. Or with my experience of coming through the branch network, say, well, have you done this? Have you checked that? Have you been visible? That sort of thing. So I know I wouldn't immediately default to saying that it was that because of that example. I gave you that example because I remember it.
If we could turn up POL 000333169, please. These are a series of slides that you've seen about the role of the contract manager. We'll just wait for them. There they are. And you say you don't know where these slides are from or the audience, but that the content looked accurate. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, my immediate observation was there's no date or time on it. And what I would expect to see in a presentation of this type, there'd be an author. So typically in slide 1, there would be an author or the presenter would be in there. But when I've looked at it a bit closer, I do see that in the notes it mentions, uses the terminology instructor. So what I've deducted for that is that at some point, possibly following a restructure, the contracts team or somebody in the contracts team has provided the training team with a slide pack to brief new agents of the post office as they're working their way through classroom training.
If we could turn to page 3 of that slideshow. This sets out the network contracts team, and we can see you there under contracts advisors. Does this help you at all as to when this slideshow would have been from?
What I can tell you is it's post 2006, because this structure, thinking back at my career and the changes, this structure would have been. I can't tell you I can't give you the exact date of this slide deck, obviously, but this structure, these individuals and the line management structure and the support structure would suggest to me it's post 2006, but it could be possibly later than that. I'm not sure.
And we can see there that you answer to a Mr. John Breeden. Would that have been correct?
That's correct, yes.
And he had line management over all the contract advisors who were split by geographical area. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. He had line management responsibility for the contract managers in the north, as it says in the slide.
And if we could turn over to page 5, please. Sorry, actually, if we could go back to page 4. It sets out the main roles and responsibilities. Sub-postmaster recruitment interviews, conduct disciplinary cases, culpability cases, debt recovery, and all other contractual issues involving sub-postmasters. Is that broadly how you understood the role? Broadly
speaking, yeah, that's how the role evolved, and that's how it was set out, yeah.
And if we could turn over to page 5, please. This sets out conduct/disciplinary cases. And it gives a target. It says target 80% of conduct cases to be completed within 6 weeks from date of suspension, the remaining 20% to be completed within 8 weeks. Robust and established process to be followed in all cases. Could you explain to us what that target meant in practice?
It was very challenging, I'll be honest. It was very challenging. I always felt that because you had complexity in the mix. You also had volume, so if you had a lot of cases, that formed part of that target. I always prided myself and liked to make sure that any recommendations I was making or any investigations that were being done, 6 to 8 weeks was a very, very challenging target. But we had very little control over the setting of these targets. They were set basically, and as a team of individuals, we had to do our best to try and work within them.
Were you put under a lot of pressure to meet that target?
Yes, I think I'm happy to say that. Yeah, there was a lot of pressure because there would have been the number, the volume, and then usually cases that ended up going down the conduct route would be more complex. They could be unexplained losses. So if you have an unexplained loss, then in my mind, because I'm not qualified as a data analyst, I would need to seek and look to other areas to try and get some explanation. So 6 to 8 weeks was a very challenging target.
Do you think it may have created a temptation to just try and shut down these cases as quickly as possible?
Not in my mind. No, I would have been quite happy to fail the target, but get to the correct answer. I mean, the target was there. There could have been consequences for failing the target for me as an individual, but in my mind, it was important for me to make sure then that when we did provide answers, or indeed when we did make a formal decision, we had investigated every possible area.
What about for other people doing your job? Do you think this might have created an incentive for them to quickly want to shut down cases or resolve them?
That wasn't the impression I was getting. The impression I was getting was, right, we've got to make sure that we've got responsibility to make sure that the investigations are done properly. That wasn't the impression I was getting.
If we could turn over the page to page 6, please. This deals with audits. It says conduct cases, how can you help? Information which would be useful to the contract team. Cash declarations plus last 3 branch trading statements. Any personal checks in the account. Why are personal checks in the account potentially relevant?
Well, personal checks under the sub-postmaster's contract are not allowable. You can't encash personal checks. I mean, you can buy goods and services and use a personal check, but you couldn't write a personal check, for example, and withdraw the money from the branch and use that money to go and pay a bill or whatever. You could pay a bill in the branch by writing a check, but you couldn't write a personal check and then replace that with cash.
And what does it mean when it says Horizon event logs to identify sub-postmaster's personal involvement?
Could I just say, Ms Kennedy, when I've re-looked at this again, what I do think is, when I go back to what you asked me to start, I do believe that this presentation may have been presented to audit members who work in the field. When we look at this slide here, and it talks about information that would be made available to the contracts team on the day of the audit, it seems to make more sense now that this would have been a presentation from the team leader and the audit team to members of the audit team,
in order to help them assist you as contract managers.
Yeah. So they when they do, I mean, the whole point of this was that when you eventually had the conversation with the postmaster or your line manager at the end of the audit, instead of saying to the postmaster, look, we're going to have to go away and check this stuff or find out what's actually happened with regard to these areas, it was really just to make sure that they were taking responsibility for checking these things when the conversation took place.
And turning back then to Horizon event logs, what were those, and how did they identify sub-postmaster's personal involvement?
From memory, I would have been heavily dependent and guided on what the auditor was telling me. So if there had been an event or something that had taken place in that event that looked peculiar or abnormal, I'd be heavy reliant on them to say, look, Brian, well, this was done, but it doesn't look quite right. Now, if that had been a systemic problem, if they'd said to me, then we would have had that discussion. But they may have been able, at that point in time, before any further investigations took place, I might have been happy to accept their explanation before I had a discussion with my line manager.
So generally, would you defer to what the auditors thought about these Horizon event logs?
They had much more experience. I think I said earlier in my statement, I think 4 hours training in the Horizon system, and on an ad hoc basis working on the counter. They were much better placed through their experience to actually go into I think they could go back a month. So any events that had happened in the last 30 days or whatever, because I would ask that question if it had been raised, what have you actually checked here? I had to be satisfied in my mind that based on this checklist of reports and other checks, that before I had a discussion with my line manager, every possible check had been done.
I'm now going to ask you some questions about Calendar Square. If we could pull up FU...
Before you do, Miss, it's a small point, Mr. Trotter, but on the first slide, we don't need to get it up again. There was a demarcation between north and south.
Yes.
I'm just curious where north ended and south began.
Right. To be honest, I think it was a moving line because as you went through the passage of time and the numbers reduced, in those days it would probably have been running along the Scottish border into North England.
Right, that's what I wanted to ask you, really.
Yeah.
Did the north include parts of the north of England from time to time?
It did, depending on the structure, yes, at that time.
Fine. So it wasn't exclusive to Scotland. It was sometimes the north of England as well. Fine. Thank you very much.
And I think I said as well, at some point in time through memory, it did include Northern Ireland as well.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Sorry, Miss Kennedy.
Not at all. Turning then to the calendar square, FUJ 0008315. This is an area intervention manager visit log, and we can see the name there is Sandra McKay, who was the area intervention manager. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
And we can see that the branch there is Calendar Square, and this is the 12th of January 2006. If we could scroll over to the second page, please, and scrolling down. Actually, sorry, up again. It says under action, Brian to email Sean Turner to request that Horizon Kit is checked / replaced to try to eliminate problems currently being experienced in the office. And scrolling down, it says, as instructed by APM, I visited the branch to go over the audit report of the 8th of December 2005. Brian Trotter, CNSM, was with me during the visit. So you've gone along with Sandra McKay to this visit following an audit, is that right?
Yeah, the reason behind that was Sandra was new to the job. It was a new role for her, although I'd known her previously in some other roles. The other reason was that I knew the branch well from my area manager days. From a location point of view, it's less than 5 miles away from where I live. The postmaster I knew him pretty well as well, again from previous structures. And he also had another branch nearby. So the postmaster in question here, although this is about Calendar Square, so did have 2 branches. So a combination of those things, I felt that it was appropriate to go along. In addition to that, Sandra and I had obviously had some telephone conversations about our worries about Calendar Square and what the postmaster had told her.
So you wouldn't normally go along to this, or necessarily go along to this type of visit?
No.
And I think you say in your statement that you think that this was brought to your attention via, or this visit came about because of the helpline. Is that right?
Yeah. I'm just trying to place it in a time, 2006. The NBSC would probably have been in operation then. The postmaster, again, looking at the emails, it looks like he's already escalated it to the Horizon System Helpline and also, I believe, the NBSC. So that escalation's taking place. From what I've deducted, and I'm sort of speculating here, looking at the emails, he hasn't been given, or he hasn't received the response that he was expecting. So he's gone back to the helpline and said, well, I'd like to speak to my contracts manager or whatever. That's come through to the area performance manager or the area office, and they have put a high priority on it and asked Sandra to go and visit the office, and I've agreed to support that.
Yeah, returning to the text, it says, discuss the report fully with the SPMR and the recommendations that have been made by the audit team. The SPMR is aware of his responsibilities and agreed to complete the training records as outlined in Appendix A relating to AML and FS. What do those mean in that context?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
What do AML and FS stand for?
All right. Sorry. Oh, anti-money laundering, sorry, that's, again, these are regulatory requirements by the postmasters. So that it's like tests they have to complete, including the staff, and also financial service regulations as well.
All issues in Appendix B were discussed, and I am satisfied the SPMR has taken the necessary steps to rectify. We discussed the problems that had been encountered in September with the Horizon system and the more recent recurrence. Alan, SPMR, showed Brian and myself the balanced snapshots from the 5th of January 2006, showing the problems with the communications between nodes. I've already contacted Sean Turner asking for help to rectify the system problems, and Brian has agreed that he will also email him reiterating the need for the system to be checked or the kit replaced. At this stage, it looks as though, or it reads to me, as though you think the issue might be with the kit itself rather than Horizon. Is that fair? Was that your first instinct?
That was the impression I got, and it was through conversations, obviously, in the office with the postmaster. I also took into consideration that we were speaking to somebody who was very experienced. He was running 2 branches, running them well. He employed a lot of staff. So I was really taking all of those things into consideration when I was sort of coming up with some sort of rationale. And for me, having said that, and although it's not mentioned there, there was also quite a high shortfall, a very high shortfall actually, that had been discussed. So taking all those things into consideration, in my mind, yes, to answer your question, I thought it was a kit, but definitely needed further investigation.
And you thought it was the kit because you thought, as you've just said, this is a good sub-postmaster, it's a high shortfall. All of the evidence points to the fact that there might be something else going on, but all you could think of at that time was, it's the kit. Is that right?
Well, the reason I've said that is because it mentions nodes, and I was technical enough to know that nodes was actually a piece of kit that sat in every counter position. So the explanation I was getting or being given was that there seemed to be a problem with the kit communicating with each other. But again, the limited knowledge that I had of the Horizon system, that's sort of where it finished. It started sort of and ended.
At this stage, would you have been aware of the prospect of bugs, errors, defects?
No. I like I saying, go back to what I said earlier. I'd always thought it was fit for purpose and operated as intended.
If we could pull up the next document, which is FUJ 000837770, please. And if we could turn to page 6. This is an email chain from around the same time. I think it's the day before that log. And we can see an email from Sandra McKay to Sean Turner copying you in. And it says, you may recall that in September, the above office had major problems with their Horizon system relating to transfers between stock units. So that acknowledges that this is a problem branch that the MBSC and you were aware there was a problem with. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
And it goes on to say the SPMR has reported that he is again experiencing problems with transfers the 5th of January 2006, which resulted in a loss of around 43,000. That's the large shortfall that you were referring to a moment ago. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Which has subsequently rectified itself. I know the SPMR has reported this to Horizon Support, who have come back to him stating they cannot find any problem. Clearly the SPMR is concerned as we have just spent a number of months trying to sort out the first instance and he doesn't want to repeat performance. He is convinced there's something wrong with his Horizon kit. I would be grateful if you could investigate this and give him any support you can. I'm due to visit the office tomorrow to have a look at his paperwork and discuss the situation with him. And if we scroll up, it's an email from you then to Sean, saying further to Sandra's email, I visited the branch with Sandra last week and the SPMR provided clear documented evidence that something very wrong is occurring with some of the processes when carrying out the transfers between the stock units. To be absolutely sure from our side, can we either carry out a thorough check of the alleged faulty processes or swap them out? So at this stage, you are very much convinced that the problem is not the sub-postmaster, the problem is the system itself. Is that fair?
Yeah, so basically during the visit, the postmaster had presented to us a number of documents, I think there were transfer receipts showing that although it was going through one node, it wasn't appearing to the other. So with our, because I would class Sandra in this as well, with our limited knowledge of the kit, how it operated, and also the software, I've personally felt responsible for making sure that we could take this as far as we could take it. My mind at this time, if you're asking the question, was on the kit and also this shortfall and getting things sorted out so we could get things back to a steady state, and the postmaster would feel, and his staff would feel confident in using and operating the system.
And if we could turn up your statement again, please. It's WITN 00980100, please. And if we could turn to page 10, please. Paragraph 33. It says, this appeared to be an isolated issue and it was not within my skills or remit to understand the nature of these problems. Is that right? Was it really an isolated issue? Because it seems, on the basis of what we've gone through, that this was something that had happened in the branch before and was continuing to happen.
From my experience and knowledge, it was isolated to Calendar Square. I think that's what I'm saying there in my statement. And when it did reappear or reoccur, I had no doubt in my mind that it needed and required further investigation. But in terms of what I put in my statement here, although it says isolated, I do accept that it did happen again.
If we could turn up the next document, POL 000300241, please. This is another email chain with some overlap to the last one, but if we look at this front page, we can see that Sean Turner, and scrolling down please, Sean Turner is emailing you and Sandra to say pretty much the same status with Calendar Square. So we're now in March, this is the 2nd of March. They need to let Horizon Systems Desk know if they have any further problems, and the fix should be down to them with the S90 release, as stated in my previous email. As you can see from the email below, though, there is now recognition that this is wider than just a software quirk at just one branch, which means it's now being actively managed as a cross-domain problem with Fujitsu. So Sean Turner is telling you in terms there, this isn't isolated. This is an issue that's affecting numerous branches.
Yeah, I accept that's how the email reads, yeah, accept that.
Do you remember receiving this email?
Not specifically. Obviously, it's happened quite a considerable period of time ago. So without seeing the bundles, I don't specifically remember seeing that email and reading it at the time.
But isn't that quite shocking? You thought that there was nothing wrong with Horizon, and here you are being told that there's an issue that's cropping up in a number of places.
Well, it was shocking to me because, you know, if we put the email in its time and place, the conversations or discussions that I would be having with my colleagues in the team and also with my line manager, for me, I don't recall being told or somebody saying to me, look, this is a bigger problem that we need to worry about. For me, that would certainly, there'd be alarm bells ringing for me. But yeah, I do accept what you're saying there.
And if we turn to page 3, so this is a thread I think that's been forwarded to you. So that's you would have received the rest of the email thread. And if we scroll down, we can see an email from Anne Chambers. Did you ever come across Anne Chambers?
No. One of the things I've deducted from the bundles and email chains, and quite a number of the emails, myself and Sandra Mackay we're not copied in. So again, going back to what I knew of these emails, what investigations were going on, was completely unknown to me.
But if we scroll back to the first page and to the bottom, it looks as though this particular chain has been forwarded to you. I appreciate you weren't copied into the email I was about to take you to, but you were forwarded this email chain, were you
Yes,
not?
yeah, at the home, yeah.
So if
I,
we, sorry, you go.
I don't recall seeing it. If that's the question that you're asking me.
Yeah.
My main focus, I guess, was on the latest email, what was being reported, what investigations had been done, and I think I did say in my witness statement that when I reviewed these emails, some of the terminology that was being used was way outside of what I understood of, how the software operated, how the hardware worked. I struggled with some of the terminology, and I think I've said that in my witness statement.
If we could turn back to page 3, and if we could scroll down, it may be that this is one of those emails where you say that you don't understand the terminology, but I'm going to take you to it. So if we look at this email from Anne Chambers, it says, haven't looked at the recent evidence, but I know in the past this site had hit this riposte lock problem 2 or 3 times within a few weeks. This problem has been around for years and affects a number of sites most weeks. And finally, ESHA say they have done something about it. I'm interested in whether they really have fixed it, which is why I left the call open, to remind me to check over the whole estate once S90 is live. Call me cynical, but I do not just accept a third party's word that they have fixed something. What I never got to the bottom of, having usually had more pressing things to do, was why this outlet was particularly prone to the problem. Possibly because they follow some particular procedure or sequence, which makes it more likely to happen. This could still be worth investigating, especially if they have continuing problems, but I don't think it is worthwhile until we know the S90 position. So this email, is this an email you would have looked at and thought, I don't understand the terminology there or the technological speak, I'm not going to engage in it?
I guess if I put it in context, there's 2 things. The technological speak I would have struggled with. I guess in hindsight, the alarming thing for me is, having seen it in the bundle, is that it had been going on for years. And going back to what I said earlier in my witness statement, that the people I was speaking to, the comms that I was getting was the bigger picture. The wider picture was this appeared to be isolated. So putting this in context in this email chain, that would alarm me, having seen that there's a wider problem. I guess if at the time if I'd seen it, I would have been speaking to my boss and my line manager and saying, well, is there a wider problem? And he may have said to me, well, he may have known or not known, but if there'd been a wider problem in my area with more branches having the same sort of issues, I would like to have known about it.
I mean, she also seems to say that she's not convinced that this fix will actually work. So there's a big problem, but there's also a technical person saying, I'm not sure that this fix will actually work. Isn't that extremely concerning?
It is, yes. It is, yeah. I accept that.
And so, as I've taken you to, this was an email that you were forwarded at the time. What would it have taken for you to go to your line manager and say, this is a real issue, I'm worried about the system? Would it have been someone saying to you, there's a problem with the system, we need to take action? What would it have taken?
It would probably somebody more qualified than me to say, look, actually, reading this email in its context, there's a bigger issue here, it needs escalated. And I would speak to my line manager and say, look, it's not just Calendar Square, according to this individual's email. I wouldn't have been frightened to push it back up the line if there's a wider problem, if that's what you're asking. I wouldn't have just sat on it and thought, well, it's only Calendar Square and that's it. But I could only comment on what I was hearing at the time and being told at the time.
If we could turn up your witness statement again, WITN 00980100, and page 21, please. Just looking at paragraph 78 there, which is at the bottom. You say, the limits of my role in investigating incidents meant that I was relying on the audit team, the security team, and any associated teams, e.g. IT teams or Horizon teams, who would have been involved if there were allegations or suspicions of system errors. With the exception of the incident above, which is the Calendar Square one. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
where Fujitsu were involved, I was not aware of any credible suspicions of system errors. In the cases we investigated, the issues were resolved by training if there was a suspension by appointing a temporary or replacement postmasters, or explained by admissions from postmasters. As a result, there was a context which pointed towards human error being the cause of issues and not system errors. It would have been impossible for someone in my position to discriminate between human errors and system errors, but I accept that the same might be true of postmasters themselves in some cases. With the benefit of hindsight, wasn't this Calendar Square incident, couldn't it have been a huge wake-up call for you to look at whether or not there were system errors when shortfalls arose for sub-postmasters?
It could have been, yeah, but like I say, I was doing my best in the role that I was in to push as hard as I could. And back to the technical teams, people that were much more qualified than me to look at why, the kit wasn't communicating with each other. The other issue was that this 43k shortfall that appears to have been resolved. I haven't seen any mention of that in the bundles, but I think I was trying to do the best that I could do with the information that I had, and speaking to people within my sphere that could push it harder.
If we could take that down, please. I'm now going to move to ask you some questions about another incident. If we could turn up POL 404403, please. And this concerns Winlaton Mill. Am I saying that correctly?
It is, yes, and I believe it's in North England, that branch. So it's a going back to what was asked earlier, I'm kind of confused why I've been involved in this, but it may be for some valid reason. Yes, so to answer your question, it's Winlaton Mill.
So if we could turn to page 6, please. And scrolling down. This is, who's Jacqueline Witham?
So Jackie Witham, at that time, looking at the dates of the email, would have been quite senior, I think, maybe in the product and branch accounting team, and she would have been responsible for flagging or pushing this paperwork out to the contracts team for basically to escalate it and contract intervention.
And is that what she's doing here by emailing you?
Yeah, reading the email and again trying to rely on my knowledge and experience. The form that's been addressed, been referred to at the time, was a process that had been agreed, probably at quite a higher senior level, on how we should deal with any shortfalls or any discrepancies that had occurred in branches.
And if we turn back to page 5, we can see that there's an outstanding debt. That's why this has come to you. Yeah. And if we scroll down, we can see that you then emailed Neil Barnard. Who was Neil Barnard? So
again, probably another restructure. I'm not sure of the time. Neil was a business development manager, so he was responsible, a bit like when I was an area manager, for developing the relationship between him and the branches in his area.
And what you're doing in this email, which is in November 2006, is you say, please see attached, I think this warrants further investigation. Can you contact the branch, advise that because a debt is already be repaid, this new debt will need to be settled in full immediately. If the branch is not in a position to repay, I may have to consider their contractual position. What did you mean by consider their contractual position?
Basically, that statement ties in or is aligned to that process. So if the paperwork had been referred to the contracts team, again, I'm working on my memory, there would have been a target to get it back to say, look, actually, we've already done some investigation centrally. That's been done. Evidence has been produced. That's been done. So it would have now been passed to me to see if possibly there was any grounds for recommending write-off. I see from the paperwork, this postmaster's fairly new. I'd been thinking about how much training he got, how he was coping, and that's where Neil would have come into the equation because of his relationship with the branch, the postmaster.
So Neil was going to investigate whether or not there was any basis upon which the debt could be written off.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I said earlier in the conversation, Neil was better positioned and placed because he already had that relationship with this postmaster to sit down in the branch and just go through it step by step to try and get his side of the story or version of events before we jump to any sort of, right, okay, you've got to pay it back and that's it. It was very much a case of, let's find out exactly what's happened here.
But that last line, which says, if the branch is not in a position to repay, I may have to consider their contractual position, that suggests that if the branch can't repay, they may be terminated. Is that fair?
That doesn't suggest that. Contractual position might mean, like, sending a letter to the postmaster and saying, look, we've been unable to get an explanation for this. At that time, again, looking at the date, under 12.12 of the contract, you've got a liability for all losses. You've had the conversation with Neil. Would you like to come and speak to me? It wouldn't be an immediate default to terminating somebody's contract because we couldn't get some answers to why a shortfall or a debt had occurred in the branch.
If we could turn back up the chain to page 4, please. And scrolling down, we can see what Neil says after that meeting. He says, I've made a tentative arrangement with the son of the sub-postmaster currently off sick to drop in at the branch on Wednesday afternoon. However, I thought I would come back to you to clarify some concerns I have about this. During the conversation with the son of the sub-postmaster, it appears that they have no argument against the payment of the latest shortages. However, the earlier discrepancy of £4,000 is the one that they dispute. It appears that the branch was informed of a remittance that hadn't been accounted for, and being new to the post office, were talked through how to process through Horizon without scanning the advice notice. The result was a discrepancy in the following balance. I was told the branch has not signed any agreement for deduction from remuneration for payment, which certainly used to be the requirement in the days I last got involved with this sort of thing. The branch would like the opportunity to search for the paperwork relating to the cash delivery and get some help in investigating what's gone wrong. At this stage, I'm not sure who would help, as I would certainly struggle. Can you explain to us what's going on here? What is he describing that's happening?
Well, I think there's a couple of things here. I think he mentions the fact that, if a repayment plan has been agreed with a postmaster, it needs to be agreed. We can't just automatically default to enforcement. And he's also going on about the 4,000 dispute about, and I think that's down to some inward remittances into the branch. For me, when I looked at this paperwork in the bundle, I'm at a loss to see what I actually did. Neil's obviously sent me this back. Me reading this fresh, it being sent to me, the questions I'd be saying in my mind is, okay, we've got this issue about the receipts, this other thing up, I think it's in the second paragraph, about the £4,000 discrepancy. And also, what decision I made. There's nothing in the bundle that actually shows clearly what actions I took following this email. If there is, I apologise for missing it, but I can't see it.
No, let's just take it step by step, because at the moment I'm just asking you about this email, and I'm about to ask you then about the next email that Neil sends, which is if we scroll over to page 3 and scrolling down. This is an email that says, with reference to my recent visit to the above branch to discuss the various discrepancies at the above branch, there were a number of points raised which I hope you can help with. You can help with some clarification or advice. And he raises a number of questions there, asking for further guidance. And he then says at the bottom of that, if you can provide the date, scrolling over, and evidence to support this error, it may be possible to shed some light on how such a small branch could lose an amount equivalent to the remittance. Although I have no previous knowledge of the branch, it would appear that the branch has been naive in accepting all of the above without question, without any supporting evidence. As things stand, they will end up paying half of their remuneration back to cover these repayments, which would certainly affect the viability of the branch. So leaving aside any decision that you did or did not take on this branch, generally, was the attitude, it doesn't matter whether it looks ridiculous or implausible that a branch could lose this money, they're still liable if there's a debt showing on horizon, or generally?
Well, generally that's what the contract said, but I think going back to the top of that email and who had been addressed to, it looks like conversations have already taken place directly with the postmaster that didn't involve the contract team for enforcement. That's where I go back to the last paragraph there. There has been naivety, and I don't really remember if the postmaster or somebody else contacted me directly to say, look, this is ridiculous. We're having to pay this money back, and these investigations haven't been done. But when I go back to the top of the email, I guess to answer your question, I trusted these individuals that had been dealing with this type of scenario and situation daily, that they would take responsibility for investigating any of these errors, shortages in the branch fully before it came to the contracts team.
If we could then turn to page 2 on this email thread, so this is further up again. So this is your email then, which says, Neil, and this is following the emails that we've just gone through. As far as I can see to date, we have not received any documentary evidence from the sub-postmaster stating that he is not liable for the loss of £1,463.07. I therefore have two options. One, you have one last go at recovering the money, or two, I write to the sub-postmaster and invite him to a fact-finding interview to explain why he is still refusing to pay. If you opt for one, can you let me know how things progress? So here, you are saying, if we don't have any documentary evidence from the sub-postmaster themselves, we're potentially going to enforce the debt obligation. Is that right?
Well, I think what I'm saying in that email is that if it's two in its contracts, I would like to speak to the postmaster directly, because he may have something to say to me or show something to me that might involve me pushing it back up the line again. I think I said at the start, I wouldn't automatically default to, right, you're paying the money and that's it. I think it's important that we get a full explanation from the postmaster. And I realise and I appreciate there's other emails in the bundle or in the email chain where conversations have taken place. In terms of the process for this, I would be under scrutiny, yes, to provide answers, because like any other debt recovery process that was in place, there was targets, there was timescales. So I guess the question would be getting asked of me, what have you done to progress this? And rather than just say, right, that's it, you have to pay the money back because that's what your contract says. In my mind, I still wanted to be satisfied that I had a conversation with the postmaster to possibly just go through it again, review the paperwork, and I might have recommended, actually, he's new, I'd look at the training, does this warrant write-off? And I'd push it back up the line. So that's when I said to you, yes, it's important in its context here, but my observations and reading the emails, there's no final decision for me here from what I did, what I said, who I passed it back to.
Did you feel like you were ever under pressure from the post office to recover debt and to gather money for the post office?
Yes, I'm happy to say that, yeah. There was targets that were performance related, so yeah. And for using this as an example, there was a target for this process.
What was that target?
I can't remember, but it may have been a couple of weeks. Typically how it would work is all of the just to take it back a step, the discrepancy would come to light. Conversations would take place, probably lengthy ones, with the postmaster and the product and branch trading team. When they had been exhausted, then typically it became part of the concurrence process. From memory, I believe that had a target, a deadline, to push it back up the line and say, look, this is what's actually been done. So yes, to answer your question, there was pressure, yeah.
Chair, that might be a convenient moment for a break. I don't have much left at all. Would now be a fine moment for a break? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, of course. So what's the time now?
11:10.
All right, 25 past?
Yes, thank you, Chair.
All right, thank you.
Chair.
Hello.
Picking back up from after the break. Mr. Trotter, in 2009, were you aware of a Computer Weekly article?
I was aware of it, yeah. I'd heard it being spoken about within the business. From memory, I may have read it, yeah. I do remember hearing about it, yeah.
What were people saying about it within the business?
I think the general feeling was that this article had been written. If you were asking me about the credibility of the article, I don't think I'd be qualified to actually say to you what my understanding was of what was being said against the messaging in the business. So, although I may have read it, I don't think I'd have been qualified to put that alongside what has been told in the business in terms of the Horizon system and its operation.
What were you being told in the business at that time?
As I've said in my statement, I can only speak from a user point of view, albeit limited, and it all seemed to work okay when I used it. And through my involvement, my interactions with agents, they seemed to be limited. When there was a question mark, with the limited power that I had, I tried to push it as far as I could push it, and put it in the hands of what I thought were qualified people. And that's as much as I could say about it.
Do you think there was a sea change in 2009 or a more forceful message being communicated within the post office that Horizon was robust and it couldn't be at fault?
Possibly. I did watch some of the sessions yesterday, and it did prompt some reminders to me that, yeah, I mean, I don't recall actually seeing those communications, but it can't be ignored. There's dates there, there's information there about the Horizon system, its integrity and that sort of thing. So having watched the inquiry and watched the sessions yesterday, at that time, if it's at that, in that context, it could have been the case.
I want to ask you about one more document. If we could pull up POL 00005245. I know you say you don't recall this note or this meeting, and you don't know who wrote it. I'm not going to ask you in detail about this particular case, but we can see that it's a meeting Monday the 27th of July 2015, and someone has written it's a meeting with you as the agent contract advisor.
Yes.
Yes, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just confirming that's correct, yeah.
There's just one aspect that's recorded in this note that I wanted to ask you about. So if we could scroll down. There's discussion about a discrepancy and a shortage and trying to resolve that shortage. And in the second bullet point, I wanted to ask you about the line that says, I had to accept the correction as it was a Wednesday and with balance, etc. I couldn't continue without doing so. I spoke to Jill Southern, who issued the correction on behalf of the cash centre. Was your understanding of the Horizon system that you had to accept something or you be prohibited from continuing to trade?
I can only speak from my knowledge and experience, but my understanding of the issue of transactional corrections were, if they were issued to the branch, then they did have the ability to send them back or speak to somebody and say, look, actually, this warrants further investigation. But I'm talking really from an experience. If that had been put in front of me, I would probably have had to go away and check with somebody and say, look, if you get it's an electronic message basically, but there is a possibility that if it had landed at certain times of the month, because at the end of every month, there were mandatory procedures, but I'm not 100% sure. If it had to be, I think what you're asking me is this forced, and I'm not 100% sure.
What were the mandatory procedures that you just mentioned?
Well, the mandatory monthly procedures are completing the branch trading statement, where you have to make a declaration at the end of that, obviously. And you've got the option there to settle centrally any discrepancy. Whether that formed part of this and it was settled centrally and it became part of a wider investigation. I mean, I do recall from memory that there was some problems, with checks that at this post office, and that I think through my intervention we'd push for further investigation, just to try and bottom out why there was a problem. But to answer your question, I don't think I'm 100% sure if this is a forced instruction that the postmaster would have to have complied with.
That document can come down. Thank you. There are a few questions from the core participants. One of those questions is, were you aware of members of the audit team being union members?
I mean, I guess that they could be in the union, but would it have been?
Was it something you were aware of at the time?
No. Their personal circumstances might have been some interest, but not. To answer your question, no.
And were you aware if there were ever situations where an auditor was investigating a fellow union member?
No.
You mentioned in your statement that you would investigate issues if they were raised by an NFSP representative. What would you do if there were issues raised by an NFSP representative?
Well, I like to say I certainly prided myself on having a good relationship with the NFSP. So typically, outside the sphere of it being through an audit, if they'd come to me and say, "Look, Brian, this doesn't look right. Can you take it forward?" I think throughout my career, I tried to encourage the dialogue and the relationship we had with the NFSP, but I would struggle to actually give you an example of an actual case. It was more about the relationship and working together.
And did you feel the NFSP stood up for their union members effectively?
Absolutely, yeah. That's the impression I got, yeah.
Investigations carried out in Scotland had to be handed over to state agencies to prosecute. Do you know whether this had any effect on how investigations were carried out?
I've got no idea. Like I said, I think I said in my statement, the interactions that I had personally in my role were limited with the security team.
I think you mentioned in your statement that you received media training.
Yeah.
What kind of training is that?
The whole point of the media training was, and it was probably, well, I went through it twice actually. It was more to deal with any comments that we got from the media or the public about branches closing, so that we were equipped to actually explain why a branch had shut. So, for example, it could have been as a result of a suspension. If any calls were fielded, we felt that, or the business felt that we should be equipped to deal with those sorts of calls or inquiries.
And what would you typically be told to say?
Well, if it was a suspension, it was a confidential matter between the post office and the individual. So we'd be told to say, I mean, there would be a brief, but basically unexplained circumstances. You know, that it was kept very much. It's a private matter between the individual and the post office until that investigation had been concluded. Then the conversation really that we wanted to have with the media was the efforts we were making to reinstate service if a closure had taken place. It was more like a positive discussion rather than negative.
Were you ever briefed to say it's closed because the sub-postmaster was stealing from the till or anything like that?
Never in my experience, never.
I understand that you are now back working for the post office, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
What are you doing at the post office now?
I actually rejoined the post office last year in July on a fixed term contract for a year. So I work in the historical matters unit, dealing with postmasters' claims and redress.
And what does that involve?
Well, it's basically the area that I look in is dealing with claims of as classed as lost pay or pay lost during suspension. So it's going back over when the policy changed, I think it was 2011. So any postmasters that lost pay, they can actually apply to the scheme to have the lost monies repaid.
Is that connected with Horizon or something else?
It's connected with suspension, right? It could have been any suspension case. It's not specifically Horizon.
Thank you, Mr. Trotter. Those are the end of my questions. I can see Mr. Jacob has a question.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions in relation to a couple of the clients who I represent. Mr. Trotter, I act for 156 sub-postmasters who instruct Howe & Co. And you have been asked about your role in investigating sub-postmasters. I want to ask you about one of our clients, Louise Darr. You may recall you gave evidence in the group litigation, and she was a lead witness there. Can I take you to WIT N02 2890100, please? And it's page 15 of 20. That should come up on your screen in a minute. Just waiting for it to come up.
I'm afraid I'm being told the number is wrong.
Oh, I'll try again. I've got it on my screen here. WITN 028 90100. It's the witness statement of Louise Darr. Great, thank you. And if we could have page 15 of 20 up, please. And go to paragraph 87. Now, Ms. Darr says in that paragraph, I was treated like a criminal by the post office. This is in relation to the alleged shortfalls emanating from the Horizon system. And she says when she sought help from the post office audit team were extremely callous and made no attempt to find the root cause of the alleged shortfalls. Specifically, Brian Trotter, my contracts manager, was particularly keen to get me to admit to falsifying books. He asked me to admit to this several times. Do you recall this?
Yes, I've watched the Human Impact video twice. I've actually read the statement twice.
Oh, good.
I'm shocked by that comment, quite frankly. I can't prove this discussion didn't take place, but it's not the sort of thing that I would have been saying to anybody. And I'm not completely sure what audit she's referring to, when it took place, what the shortfall was, but it's not. I think in the Human Impact hearing, I think she does refer to it as a phone call, phone calls.
Well, yes, and she said in her evidence in the High Court that this happened within phone calls about 7 or 8 times between you and her, and you would repeatedly ask her, did you falsify the books? Did you falsify the books? So that's her account. Do you remember speaking to her on the phone?
I may have spoken to her on the phone about several things. Obviously, at the start of her journey when she was applying for the post office, she had several problems with her application. That was before she took over. So yes, telephone calls or conversations would have taken place. In terms of my role and in making sure that I kept the process, if that's the best description, it wasn't the done thing to actually discuss things of this private nature in a telephone call. If a face-to-face meeting had taken place, generally speaking, it had been recorded, and the postmaster got a copy of that recording. But I can't remember having these conversations. I'm sorry if that's what you're asking me.
Well, you've said in your evidence that you were under pressure because of timescales and deadlines.
Yeah.
many of our clients have said they were told when interviewed and during audits that if they pleaded to false accounting, they would not be prosecuted for theft. Is this something that you were aware of, and were you under instructions to obtain a confession from sub-postmasters in relation to falsifying accounts?
Well, that statement would be outside of my sphere of control and responsibility anyway, because I wouldn't be dealing with prosecutions. I'd be looking at contractual breach and things that actually happened in the branch. So I wouldn't be looking to agree something with Mrs. Dard that was out with my control. But like I say,
yeah, I think the question was really this wider idea that the Post Office were trying to get sub-postmasters to agree that they were guilty of false accounting in relation to dropping a theft charge, which came at a later point. I just want to know, did that filter down to the initial interviews and the initial investigations? Was that something that contracts managers or investigators were trying to look at during that process, that earlier process?
not really. We went through it was a strict protocol actually of reports that had to be done. Any decision or any recommendation that I made was under heavy scrutiny. I think I've mentioned in my witness statement, I didn't make the final decision in any of these. And certainly the benefit of the doubt would have been given to the agent. If Mrs. Dare had said something to me, Brian, I've got these unexplained losses, I'm tearing my hair out, can you help me? It's in my nature to be helpful and supportive. Like I say, I do not recall having these conversations or saying anything like that.
Were you under instructions? I mean, you've said earlier on, in respect of your answers to Miss Kennedy, that several sub-postmasters made admissions, made confessions. Were you under instructions to obtain admissions or confessions from sub-postmasters?
No. Like I said earlier, and when I was being asked the question, and I can't put a percentage on it, so I'm sorry, but there was a number of cases, a number of times where almost immediately after walking into the office, the postmaster would want to speak to the auditor privately, to possibly, it was like getting it off their chest. But in this particular case, I don't, well, certainly from memory, that wasn't the situation here, from the information I've been sent and my recollection of the case.
Okay, well, I have to obviously suggest to you that is what happened, because that's Ms. Dar's evidence.
Well, I can only tell you what I recall and how I conducted myself as a contracts manager.
I'm going to ask you about another one of our clients now, Shazia Sadiq. You said that you followed the evidence yesterday.
Yeah.
Did you hear the evidence of Miss Peacock?
Yes, I watched some of it, yeah.
So essentially you would have heard that Miss Sadiq was a sub-postmistress with 3 branches in Newcastle. She paid over £10,000 in relation to Horizon shortfalls that were alleged. Post Office demanded another £20,000 from her, and she became a victim of cyber fraud, which she later found out affected 11 other branches, and Post Office sought to recover nearly £34,000 from her. Can we go to her statement, please? And that is WITNO 2230100. Hope I've given you the right number this time. Thank you. And page 13 of 16, please. And if we go to paragraph 72, you'll see that Ms. Sadiq describes a very distressing experience when she was attacked with the children in the street and called a thief because the post office had closed. And then moving on to paragraph 76, this led for her to flee her home. She fled her home with just her children's teddy bears and toys. And if we could then move, please, to page 14 of 16, paragraph 82. and if we could probably highlight 82 if that's possible. So, Ms. Sadiq says, I have received threatening calls to my mobile phone and emails from Stephen Bradshaw and Brian Trotter. Mr. Bradshaw was a post office security officer and Mr. Trotter was a post office contracts manager. Do you recall contacting Ms. Sadiq, Mr. Trotter?
No, I'm sorry, I don't.
Ms. Sadiq says that you telephoned her on at least 10 occasions. Do you recall that?
No.
Do you remember any incident when there was a sub-postmaster who had a MoneyGram loss and you telling that sub-postmaster that they were responsible for paying for that because they hadn't followed procedures?
What I do recall, and I'm sorry I can't put a time and a date on it, was when these losses occurred. I do, and this is from memory, so I apologise. In the contracts team, because of the number and also the values, there was a dedicated team set up. I wasn't part of that team. I can confirm that, where they were actually they were responsible for engaging directly with these postmasters to talk about these shortfalls that happened in these branches. In terms of, I may have spoken to her on the phone. I don't believe it was 10 times. It certainly wouldn't have been in any sort of threatening sort of way. I may have called her up and said, look, actually, out of courtesy, because that may have been in my area at that time, this has occurred. Somebody in our team will be making direct contact with you to talk about next steps. But I was not. I do believe, and I think my memory is pretty clear here. We had a dedicated team within the contracts team at that time who dealt specifically with MoneyGram losses or shortages or shortfalls.
Did you, in your work for recovering losses from sub-postmasters, did you deal with the post office security team?
Rarely, very rarely. Like I say, they looked at if there was any evidence of criminality, they dealt with it. Our role in the contracts team was to deal with any contractual breach. Very rarely did our passes cross. The interactions were few and far between and limited.
Ms. Sadiq says that you were working with a security officer in her case, and that officer was Mr. Bradshaw. Do you recall that?
I don't recall that, no.
Can we move through then to paragraph 83 on the same statement? Just waiting for it to come on the screen. I'm sorry, it's page 14 of 16. So the final paragraph there, she says that she received a number of calls that were intimidating from Stephen Bradshaw, a security officer. How did the contracts managers and the security team work together? What interaction did they have in cases of this kind?
Like I said, interactions from my experience, and I can only speak about how I operated, but we should all be operating the same way, unless they had some intelligence, some information to share. That was it. But their responsibility was to look at any elements of reported criminality, and it was quite clear we were looking at contractual breach that had been as a result of an audit or whatever. In this particular case, if we're talking about the MoneyGram shortfalls, I can't give you an answer on why both parties are involved. All I can tell you is that at this time there was a dedicated team, including a senior manager, who was dealing specifically with MoneyGram shortfalls, and I wasn't in that team.
You may not be able to answer this question, Mr. Trotter. Many of our clients have said that post office security officers engaged in bullying and thuggish behaviour, shouted at sub-postmasters, accused them of stealing. Were you aware of heavy-handed behaviour from the security team?
Directly, I wasn't aware of that in terms of, because obviously, as I've said already, they were independent investigations dealing with. There could be similarities but different, but to my knowledge and my experience, I don't recall ever hearing anything like that, to answer your question.
If we could go to the next paragraph, please, paragraph 84. And I accept that you may not be able to answer this question, but I want to ask you whether this is something that you were aware of indirectly. So Ms. Sadiq says, on the 29th of September 2016 at 13:44, Stephen Bradshaw called me and I refused to speak to him because I didn't know who he was or who he worked for. In that telephone call, which was witnessed by my husband on loudspeaker, he called me a bitch, which I found extremely distressing. Ms. Sadiq says that Mr. Bradshaw called her at least 60 times. Were you aware of this sort of approach going on by members of the security team?
Well, firstly, it's the first time I've seen this statement, and I'm shocked by those comments. And to answer your question, no.
What procedures were there within the post office to curb or to check this sort of thuggish behaviour from the security team?
I don't know, because I didn't work for the security team. If you ask me about the contracts team, I think it's been covered earlier in some of the slides about the steps, the formal steps that we were required to go through to make sure that everything was done professionally and appropriately. I cannot comment on what was going on in the security team when I wasn't part of that team.
Very well. I asked you the questions because it's my client's evidence that you were working closely with Mr. Bradshaw on her case.
I can't, and the other thing is, without seeing other evidence, I guess, throughout my career, my paths may have crossed at some point with Mr. Bradshaw and indeed other security managers, and the interactions, I would say, would be very limited. But like I say, in the contract team, there was very strict processes and procedures that we were required to follow, so that when a decision was made, we could feel that everything had been done appropriately and properly.
Well, thank you. I don't have any further questions for you.
Chair, I believe there are further questions from Mr. Maloney.
Mm-hmm.
Just one very quick one, please, sir and Mr. Trotter. And it's this, Mr. Trotter. Did any of your family work for Post Office?
Yes, my father-in-law worked for the Post Office, and my father worked for the Post Office, yeah.
And did you know a Judith Trotter working for Post Office?
The name rings a bell, but she's no relation. I think, did she work in the security team? Maybe. Yeah, I mean, the only reason it rings a bell is because of the surname, but other than that, I have no connection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Trotter. That's all I ask.
Chair, there are no further core participant questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Trotter, for attending remotely to give your oral evidence, and thank you for making a witness statement.
Thank you, sir.
And that's it for today, Ms. Kennedy?
Yes, Chair, we're back tomorrow with Mr. Andrew Wynne.
Yeah, fine. All right, then we'll see each other tomorrow. Bye.
Thank you.